you might not be able to understand my accent as well. Not northern, it's quite a long way down south from New Zealand. So if you have any problems understanding me, just let me know. We've had some excellent presentations today, first with Marie explaining the CRC and the changes from the government response, and then some presentations looking at the practical ways that organisations can look at taking energy efficiency measures and improve their performance under the CRC. What I want to run through today is some of the key areas of the CRC, the organisations that we have been looking with, both in the private and public sector, key issues that they have been dealing with and aspects that have been causing them some concern for compliance under the CRC. These are the topics that I was going to focus on today. First of all, liability. Why do organisations care about the CRC? Then just running through the structure that Marie followed this morning, and it is the basic structure that organisations will look at when they're looking at how they're going to be covered by the CRC. Firstly, who's the participant, looking at where you're responsible for supply, how your properties are going to be covered, how any exclusions will apply to you, and then ongoing, what commercial agreements you have in place and any transactional issues that may arise, and projects. So first of all, liability. We've heard this morning that it is a mandatory scheme, and there are some pretty hefty civil penalties. For example, failure to register, the maximum penalty that you're looking at there is £45,000. Obviously for large organisations that's going to be a smaller effect, but for smaller organisations that's going to be quite significant. There are criminal offences under the scheme. Directors of organisations need to sign off on the information that you're submitting for the CRC and can be liable with criminal penalties. The cost of the scheme to participants is one of the key things that people within organisations are asked by their board members. And that includes not only the registration costs, which is about £2,000 in the first year and about £1,000 in ongoing costs. You've got your cost of allowances. Some of the organisations that I'm working with, they're looking at about £6 million that they need to budget for up front. And then your ongoing internal administrative costs and compliance costs. The issue here is that when the board asks you, how much is the CRC going to cost me? The question at the moment, the answer at the moment is, well, I don't really know, because you've got revenue recycling that comes back, and although you're outlaying the cost of allowances, the question of what you're going to get back at the end of it is up in the air. So at this stage, when we haven't seen any performance league table, and perhaps how your organisation is going to look compared to other organisations, it's very hard to get to grips with what the actual cost will be for your organisation. To help determine exactly to help get to grips with exactly how the CRC will affect your organisation to the extent that you can, the first question that you need to look at is determining the CRC participant. As you can see, both private and public organisations will be looking at a number of factors. We've heard about some of these in Marie's presentation already this morning. Looking at the Companies Act definitions of parent and undertaking. Those are really wide-reaching, so that organisations need to look at whether different parts of their structure qualify as an undertaking under these definitions. An undertaking will include majority ownership, so where there's any joint ventures, that's automatically included as a subsidiary or as an undertaking, as a group member, where you've got a majority ownership in that JV. So as well as looking at whether you've got subsidiaries and JVs to cover under these definitions of undertaking, you also need to look at the definition of franchises under the order and whether your organisation has any kind of relationships that would meet that definition. Public organisations have a number of factors to look at as well. As Marie told us this morning, public authorities under the Freedom of Information Act are going to be covered under the CRC. All central government departments are covered. There's also this ability for the central government to require local authorities and other public bodies to participate in the CRC, whether or not they meet the thresholds. Non-departmental public bodies need to look at who owns them. If they're owned by a central government body, they are automatically part of that body in the CRC. If they're not, then they participate by themselves. Local authorities need to look at how schools within their area are covered. So as you can see, there are a number of factors to start considering just on this first stage of determining the CRC participant. Once you're getting comfortable with these ideas, you need to start looking at a couple of points which are quite key strategic decisions about how your organisation may be affected by the CRC. A lot of people think that nominating the primary member is just something for organisations where you have an overseas parent company. Under the wording of the draft order as it is at the moment, all organisations have the ability to nominate the primary member, and this is the person who takes on all the obligations of the CRC. So you need to be considering for your business and your operations who is best placed to take this primary member role. This is going to be the person appearing in the league table, and also with your SGUs who will be, significant group undertakings who will be appearing in the league table as well. For some organisations, you'll need to be considering your other commercial arrangements and whether or not you can nominate the correct primary member to be able to pass on costs as may be appropriate within your organisational structure. One of the key strategic decisions will be whether to disaggregate significant group undertakings. This will be, you need to look at how your organisation may function as a group or how it may function when you disaggregate. So trying to understand participation and how you might perform in the performance league table. This will be key not only for your financial reporting, but for organisations that may have SGUs that operate within different sectors. For example, we work within a client that has both water and waste organisations. And for their water arm of the business, it may be more important for them to perform well in the performance league table as compared to their waste sector business. So this option that you have for disaggregation is quite a key strategic decision for organisations' performance. Relevant decisions are a similar type of concept, but applying to the public sector, and these can apply regardless of whether or not the body itself meets the 6,000 megawatt hour threshold. So this may apply to distinct parts of public bodies that would otherwise not think that they were up for any type of liabilities under the CRC. After you've looked at who the CRC participant is, the next key aspect will be, are you responsible for supply? Previously, we had the overarching concept of counterparty to the energy supply contract. Now, the government response has slightly modified that approach, and we've seen that there will be a new updated definition of supply. There will be what is called a direct supply, which will be your usual concept of counterparty to the energy supply contract. And what this will be key for is structuring agreements going forward on any projects where you need to be considering, do I want this to be a supply agreement for the purposes of the CRC? For example, and as I'll go into a little bit more detail in one of the later slides, if you're doing any projects to generate electricity and you're wanting to gain credit under the CRC for the generation of that electricity, you need to be ensuring that the agreements that you're putting in place will fit this definition of supply and be appropriately recognised under the CRC. Indirect supply is something that the definition of supply has been expanded to cover. It's not what you would expect to cover from indirect supply, but just a specific CHP arrangement and scenario where you have the CHP arrangement in place, the person taking the electricity is responsible for the input fuel. Where there are other scenarios of indirect supply, that is captured by what is called the onward supply exclusion. So there needs to be quite a good understanding of your supply arrangements and whether they're covered under direct supply, whether it's an indirect supply, or whether it's an onward supply or not for own use exclusion. There's also the concept of self-supply to grapple with. This is predominantly for those within the energy supply business. Electricity generators in particular will be looking at this and querying the extent of the application. Self-supply, when it is for the purposes of supply, generation, distribution and transmission, is excluded from the CRC and is therefore not a supply under the CRC. There's currently very little guidance on the extent of the application of that exclusion. The fourth aspect of the definition of supply is the landlord and tenant aspect. And this is the issue that we see where if a landlord has the direct supply relationship for a building that they have tenants in, they take on the emissions responsibility under the CRC for that energy supply. I think most of us will be quite familiar now that the CRC itself doesn't have any apportionment framework within it for this, and there's no statutory right for the landlord to pass on allowance costs or indeed any provision for them to deal with revenue recycling back to tenant organisations. This means that when a landlord's trying to deal with any type of allocation of costs, these agreements will be outside of the CRC framework. There's four key options that a landlord may be looking to deal with these costs. The first option may be administratively the simplest. Simply absorb the costs and have your own revenue recycling payments back. Some organisations are taking this approach just because the administrative complexities on trying to allocate out what a cost will be to each facility that you may own is going to be a significant burden. Energy efficiency investment funds is something that the government put forward as an idea. The idea behind this is that all of the costs of allowances are paid into a pot, and all of the revenue recycling payments that you receive are paid into a pot, which that money is then applied to implement energy efficiency measures to a particular building. If a landlord looks to recover costs, there are two possible ways that they could look at doing this. Through the service charge, current commercial agreements are unlikely to have considered these type of charges, so it would be interesting to see whether any existing service charges could be used to recover these costs. A memorandum of understanding could be entered into between the landlord and tenant as to how the costs could be allocated. You then go down to issues of exactly how is a landlord going to try and charge a tenant for these allowances. Are they going to be charging them an average price for the allowances? Are they going to try and work out what the actual cost is for the allowances? Are they going to ring fence it for particular buildings that they have? So there's a lot of issues that would need to be ironed out if there is going to be a chargeback. And in all of these cases, if you're acting as a tenant, you'd want to see a lot of clarity around exactly what you're being charged for and how that works out. Other issues are the timing. The CRC operates on a financial year, whereas most of the rent review processes operate on a calendar year. You've also got issues with tenants coming in and out of buildings and how you're charging them for allowances for a year based on when you're receiving revenue recycling for that actual energy use. Other issues that you may see in leases are further restrictions on how a tenant may be able to use a building. A landlord, if they're going to be paying for the CRC costs relating to the energy use of a tenant, may be putting in further restricted covenants on the activities that can occur in the building, whether or not the tenant can alienate that lease, so that restrictions on alienation, so there can be no greater energy demanding activities taking place. And also you may see a growth in what we call green leases, which is generally landlords and tenants working together to ensure that energy efficiency is a core aspect contained within the lease. So after you've grappled with what your organisation is and which supplies you are responsible for, you're then going to be looking at the possible application of exclusions to your organisation. This has been causing quite a number of worries to a few of our clients. The CCA exclusion is a tricky one. It seems quite straightforward in that it applies on 3 separate levels, but a CCA can apply at a business trading level, which is not necessarily an undertaking that is recognised for the purposes of the CRC. So what I'm meaning there is that under the CRC you're recognised as undertaking entities, whereas a CCA could apply to a business which operates between undertakings, which then makes it quite difficult to understand which emissions you're excluding under the CRC. The other aspect of it is that the CRC applies at the facility level, and understanding that how a CCA exemption can apply to an organisation for that facility when they're not actually responsible for the supply of electricity to that building under the CRC. So those are a few key issues that people subject to CA exemptions are dealing with at the moment. The other exclusion that is causing a bit of trouble is the definition of transport. As Marie mentioned this morning, on-site transport is only exempt if it has a VERA licence or is exempt from licensing under that Act. Previously, the definition of transport was quite far-reaching, and now we've seen it restricted right back. There will be lots of organisations who had previously thought that their transport was excluded, which is now, and they're going to now have to account for that transport under this new definition. And construction companies in particular had many different operations on site that would have been covered by the old definition that will now not be covered at all. Unconsumed supply, this is what I was previously mentioning about what could be classed as indirect supply. Onward supply will be exempt from the CRC, but it's not yet clear about who will actually pick up the responsibility for that supply. Some information in the guidance says that for a JV, an onward supply will be a deemed supply to the person who actually uses the supply in a JV situation, but there's no further information about how that supply will be treated in other scenarios. So after you've gone through the definition of the CRC participant, your supply agreements, your exclusions, you start to look at transactions. This is going to be quite an important issue going forward after you've met the big hurdle of registration and getting your administrative aspects in force, but also it's key pre-CRC as well. This is because when you're registering your organisation, you need to look at the organisation as at 31 December 2008. You might have changes during the period of the year 2008, in which you have to account for through your 2008 energy use, and also in between 2008 and your registration time in 2010. So what you need to be considering there is, first of all, looking at the guidance and about how your particular transaction will be treated, and making sure that you've got the information that you require in order to be able to comply with the CRC and the registration requirements. And during phases, it'll be key to keep this in mind, because you'll be required to, particularly with transactions involving significant group undertakings, because on the year of purchase of that significant group undertaking, you'll be taking on the obligations throughout that scheme year. So that means you'll be required to report on the emissions for that organisation during the period when you weren't actually in control of that organisation. So this means that the supply of information will be key. You'll also need to be looking at the transfer of allowances inside of transactions, how that will occur, or if you've chosen not to transfer the allowances, whether or not any compensation for the price of those allowances will be taken into account as part of the transaction. So the CRC will be a key issue, well, not a key issue, but another issue to look at in a commercial due diligence transaction. The CRC will also affect any commercial arrangements that you have that deal with, that affect the energy efficiency of your organisation. There may be some agreements that you have whereby operations of your organisation are carried out by a third party, but for which you still maintain obligations under the CRC. What organisations may be looking to do will be to looking to either pass on the costs of the CRC to those third-party organisations, or ensuring that they have energy efficiency measures in those agreements, so that all of these third parties that you have agreements with will be acting in a way that ensures that you're complying with the CRC. And finally, project costs and pitches. When you're looking at pricing a job or a project such as a PFI project, you need to consider the contractual structures that will be in place once the project is up and running and throughout the construction of the process, to be able to understand who will have responsibility for supply throughout the project, and how you allocate CRC costs or incorporate the costs in the price of the project. And finally, implications for renewable energy projects. You need to consider, this is perhaps one of the last aspects of an organisation looking at the ways that they can reduce their energy consumption. We'll be starting to look at what renewable energy projects we can implement. There are, as Maria mentioned, there are several ways that renewable energy projects are incentivised under the Renewable Obligations Scheme, under which you can get ROCs, Renewable Obligation Certificates. There's also going to be a new scheme related to that called feed-in tariffs, which is fit up there. They're going to start in April 2010. You can also possibly get benefit for renewable energy under the CRC. The important thing to understand here is that you can't get all of these together. It's only one that you can claim and not all. There's no double counting under the CRC. What you need to understand is that ROCs would be generally most economically sensible for large energy projects. Feed-in tariffs are aimed at smaller energy consumption projects, but the key would be that CRC may be looked at for organisations that are looking at a wide number of small renewable energy projects to gain CRC credits to offset the allowance debit that the larger organisation has. So under the CRC for renewable projects, you purchase allowances for any inputs, importantly only where that is a supply agreement that qualifies under the CRC, and you get credits gained for supplies to third parties. As I previously mentioned, you need to ensure that the arrangement that you have with those third parties is a supply agreement for the purposes of the CRC. And key for some PFI projects, particularly for local authorities, will be to consider the joint venture implications, such that if you're looking to get credit for if you're looking to gain CRC credits, it's most likely that you need to be the majority owner in any any joint venture organisation that is trying to get the CRC credits.